Nearly 40 years ago, when I was an ordinand, I was asked to be a representative at a large World Council of Churches gathering on the subject of science and religion, which was held at Boston, Massachusetts. And at the conference, I struck up a friendship with a professor from Hungary who was on his first trip from behind what was then known as the Iron Curtain. You couldn't really get visas unless you were going to some sort of kosher organization, and the World Council of Churches was regarded as sufficiently left-wing to get a visa to leave Hungary. Anyway, he was just delighted to be there, and we struck up a friendship, went to a series of seminars on the nature of faith and in science and religion. Fairly highbrow stuff, and I remember having a cup of tea with him after about the fourth or the fifth seminar, and he said to me, "Peter, at each of these seminars I'm getting more and more confused, but each time at a higher level." And that's my hope for the day. May all our confusions be at a higher level at the end. I'm to give this introductory address, and I think, keep to the foothills of the contemporary dialogue between science and religion, and describe what I call the reaction stages on my own journey from my early studies in chemistry to my later theological studies and career in the ministry of the church. And I shall set my remarks broadly in the framework of autobiography and pause at some of the intermediate states and catalysts along my journey. Story begins in Birmingham. We'll just let this lady come in. No, they're going somewhere else. That's all right. Took one look, and I know that. Story begins in Birmingham, where I was brought up in modest circumstances, and like many of my generation, the 11 plus and grammar school opened up possibilities which had been completely denied to my parents. I rather drifted into specialising in the sciences at A-level, and generally in those days you made a sharp choice between the sciences and the arts and humanities. C.P. Snow's Two Cultures was the order of the day, and to a degree, but less so, that's still the case today. I can remember an existential moment when I was 13 or 14, when I had to choose. I'm just going to let these folk. There's some seats at the front, if you. Otherwise, do come and admire closely. There's another one over here. Here we are. And there's one over there if you'd rather be on the sidelines. No, pride of place. Well done. Parking. Anyway, I remember when I was 13 or 14, had to choose between history and biology for O-levels, and the headmaster of my school was an historian, and the expectation was that everyone in the top stream would do history. I was the only one to choose biology. And later, when I chose a topic in historical theology for my doctorate, I felt I was redeeming that early choice. But I remember that, choice we often had to make between the sciences and the humanities. In fact, I came to think that historical inquiry is actually rather like inorganic chemistry, the branch of chemistry which had attracted me most. If physical chemistry attempts a relatively complete description of physical processes, and organic chemistry is basically the chemistry of just one atom, the simplest, carbon, same number of bonding electrons as bonding orbitals. Sorry if there are any organic chemists present. But that, of course, gives the principle why you get long-chained molecules, the basis of life. Inorganic chemistry considers the rest of the inanimate world, all the other elements in the periodic table. And in the process, it attempts to discern patterns, and to try and discern why they exist, yet always with a great deal of imprecision. And there are differences, of course, but is the study of history that different? Anyway, in 1969, I went up to the University of Oxford to Merton College to read chemistry. I had an interesting range of teachers, a young Mary Archer among them. To have one's practicals marked by her was an experience both fragrant and chilling, as I recall. I did see her recently, and she was amused at one of her students fetching up the bishop. She immediately had a photograph taken and tweeted it around the world, so there we are. A future professor of chemistry, Peter Atkins, then a young lecturer in physical chemistry, also taught me. Widely appreciated for his prolific, I think very good, textbooks, he's also known for his militant atheism, as he lists in his recreations in Who's Who. A sort of sorcerer's apprentice to Richard Dawkins. Many years later, some 15 years ago, I had the great pleasure of sitting next to Peter Atkins at lunch after preaching the university sermon in Oxford. He turned out of curiosity, to meet a former student who is now a bishop. He came to lunch, that is, not to the service before lunch. As with many people who become aggressively anti-Christian, he'd had an unfortunate encounter with student evangelical Christianity. Having exonerated me to a degree from being a paid-up member of the God Squad, we had a good conversation. And as we parted, I couldn't resist saying that, unlike him, I just didn't have enough faith to be an atheist. I think he understood what I meant. But let me pick up the story from my undergraduate days. I hadn't been brought up in regular contact with the church, although school assemblies, etc., had provided a vague framework of worship and hymnody. I found myself drawn on a Christian journey, which I regard in retrospect, as I regarded at the time, as a quest for meaning. What was life about? Why was there a world? And what was the purpose of my life amid all the opportunities that I found I had? As I indicated earlier, the option of atheism seemed unattractive and unlikely to be true. Could one look at the world with its order and beauty, even if set amid much disorder and ugliness, and the flux of evolution? I wonder whether we could just close that door. I see armies of people approaching with children. Okay. Could one look at the world with its order and beauty, even if set amid much disorder and ugliness and the flux of evolution, and conclude that there was no ultimate purpose or meaning behind it? Could it all be down to chance? This seemed to me to be the way of either desperation or hubris, and certainly in human terms a considerable act of faith. Now, have we all got chairs? There's a seat here if you want. I mean, take a bucket of pebbles to the top of the church here and chuck them over the side. What's the chance they'll land saying, "Welcome to Hartford"? You'd have to do it a few times. And I still think that argument's got considerable power to it, given the complexity of the chemistry of life. On the other hand, a rather conventional view of God as essentially a distant creator who set the world in motion and only deals with it from a distance, as it were, seemed equally unsatisfactory. The world didn't run like clockwork, and life seemed to me to be too subtle, too complex, and too mysterious to support a quasi-Masonic view of God as simply the great architect, but no more. The Christian faith, by contrast, presented me with a vision of a God who not only created the world, but embraced its imperfections and limitations unto death itself, in a mysterious act of redeeming love. And over the years, this sense of the inner truth of the Christian faith and its intrinsic beauty, in what the Psalms call the beauty of holiness, have progressively impressed themselves upon me. But I freely accept the limits of our understanding. In this life, we can only see through a glass darkly. And I accept that Christian belief is vulnerable to the critique which figures such as Richard Dawkins have popularized. It's not actually a new critique. 2,000 years ago, Christians were mocked for their belief that in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, had lived a human life. They were mocked as if reinventing the old Greco-Roman myths of the gods on Mount Olympus deigning to visit the earth. Educated Gentiles 2,000 years ago thought they'd grown out of all that. To the Jewish mind, and not least with the crucifixion in mind, it was not so much a foolish as a blasphemous idea. Now, Dawkins is right to focus upon this central claim of the Christian faith, that God entered our world uniquely, and therefore, to some degree at least, necessarily mysteriously, in Jesus Christ. What he regards as mythological madness, for Christians, is the key to all wisdom. Dawkins is also right, I think, from his perspective, to assert that the universe looks exactly as it might do if there was no God. That's a claim he frequently makes. Because the essential invisibility of God is actually central to Jewish and Christian belief alike. Remember that when asked for a sign, Jesus said the only sign that would be given is the sign of Jonah, a cryptic prefiguring of the cross. The invisibility of God, which lies behind the Old Testament prohibition of idols, which marked Judaism out from the other religions of its day, is asserted as strongly in the New Testament as well. It's only in the ordinary, down-to-earth humanity of Jesus that God can be seen, and only then to the eye of faith, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who alone dwells in immortality, whom no one has ever seen or can see, at the end of 1 Timothy. This helps me to understand why worship was very important to me from the outset of my Christian journey. The Christian faith, with its mysterious and paradoxical proclamation of the birth and death of the Son of God in Jesus Christ, with its subtle combination of the assertion of God's radical presence, but also his apparent absence, naturally lends itself better to expression in worship than to theological analysis. At the heart of Christian worship in the Holy Communion is the symbolism of encounter with God through the sacrament of participation in the life and being of God himself. And this ritual celebration of the presence of God in our world and in our lives drew me. The 9 o'clock celebration of Holy Communion in the college chapel meant more to me than the set-piece sermons by well-known preachers which were offered in abundance in Oxford. And a simple celebration of Holy Communion has remained central to my spirituality. So I was always there in Merton Chapel at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, no matter what had happened on Saturday evening. I remember one time falling out of bed and getting to the communion rail, and by the time the chaplain got along to me, I'd fallen asleep. The only time in my life I've been woken up. I thought, what was he going to do, he thought. So he simply said very loudly, "The body of Christ." And up I sprang. But I had lunch with him just recently, actually, Mark Everett, and he remembers the event. In Oxford, I came across the ideas which were popularised by the distinguished nuclear physicist Peter Hodgson, maybe known to some of you, who was a fellow of Merton's neighbouring college, Corpus Christi, and a committed Roman Catholic. I was helped to understand how the metaphysical foundations of experimental science could be seen to derive precisely from the Christian belief in creation. Now, the argument isn't actually as widely appreciated as it should be, and in brief is as follows. Experimental science rests on two basic beliefs. Firstly, that nature is rational, in the sense that if an identical experiment is done on Monday and Tuesday, you should expect the same result. Secondly, that the rationality of nature is what we call a contingent rationality. That is to say, it's not a necessary rationality which might be predicted in advance. The rationality of the world has to be discovered by experiment, not by prediction from some imagined or presumed or discovered first principles. The speed of light, in principle, could be different. That's an interesting question, which I'll allude to in a moment. In the ancient world, neither of these basic beliefs was established in Greco-Roman culture. The world then was presumed to have a certain rationality, but it was essentially an otherworldly rationality which was only reflected in and adversely affected by the embodiment of life in the material world. The spiritual forces which were trapped in the material world, gremlins as we've sometimes later called them, would potentially disrupt the reliability of experimental results. So you wouldn't assume you'd get the same result on Tuesday as Monday. And that, I think, is why someone like Archimedes, clearly a proto-scientist, could never initiate a sustained cultural development of science. But in the second place, such rationality that nature has was presumed to be a necessary rationality in Greco-Roman thought, reflecting the rationality of the highest form of being. In the case of those branches of Greco-Roman thought which developed a somewhat murky concept of God, later versions of Platonism in particular, it would be the rationality of God himself. So, to take an obvious example, to Greco-Roman thought, the planets appeared to move in regular orbits and thus exhibited a certain rational behavior. But it was then assumed that their movement then must be in the most obvious form of rational motion in a circle. Copernicus correctly deduced that the planets circled around the sun. At least the maths is much more elegant if you describe them as circling around the sun. But it was Kepler in the early 17th century who deduced from the observed movements that they were in fact elliptical. Modern experimental science rapidly established itself in the 17th century. And on the 18th century, the assumptions that nature was rational, but that its rationality had to be discovered by experiment rather than by logical derivation, simply became taken for granted in European culture. What I came to appreciate was that these principles were best seen as deriving, both historically and philosophically, from the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation. The fact that nature derives from the creative will of God and was to be regarded, as Genesis puts it, as very good, means that it can be regarded as reliable. Experiments on Monday are sure to yield the same result on Tuesday, all things being equal. But on the other hand, God did not need to create. Creation was, to use the doctrinal jargon, out of nothing, a free decision of God to create. And that's really fundamental to the early Christian understanding of creation. Creation isn't a necessary act of God, it's a free act of God. An act of his love, no doubt, an act of his own inner necessity, but nevertheless completely a free act. And for reasons which, from our perspective, we simply can't fully explain, God chose to create the world as we know it. In principle, from the perspective of the Christian faith, it could have been different. The speed of light doesn't have to be the speed that it is. Though that's a question which, of course, has subsequently exercised leading philosophers and scientists, notably including Albert Einstein. Because the rationality could have taken a different form, in principle at least, it therefore had to be investigated experimentally. So why didn't science develop in Old Testament times or in the first 15 centuries of the Christian era? And historians of science argue about this. But I regard the coincidence with the theological and social revolution of the Reformation and surrounding events as not a coincidence at all. Prior to the 17th century, there were various stillbirths of science in various cultural settings. But from the 17th century, the emerging free-thinking culture of post-Renaissance, post-Reformation Christian Europe provided the cultural opportunity for the emergence of modern science. Now, I've dwelt on this a bit because it laid the foundation for my belief that science and Christianity cannot be in fundamental conflict. Christianity calls human beings to explore an understanding the world of creation and also provides the metaphysical foundations for the scientific enterprise, even if, once established in a culture, the religious infrastructure which once provided these foundations is no longer needed to support them. So you can have completely atheists, people like Peter Atkins, who nevertheless operate on the assumptions which I think were introduced by the Christian doctrine of creation. Another distinguished scientist greatly influenced me at this point, Michael Polanyi. He lived in Oxford in retirement, having been senior research fellow of my college, although I narrowly and sadly missed the opportunity to meet him in person. Some of you may not have heard of Michael Polanyi, but I regard him as one of the great minds of the 20th century. Born in Hungary in 1891, although his academic career was in Germany, a friend of Einstein in those days, and in that sort of remarkable period of the development of science in Germany in the 1920s. As part of the exodus of Jewish scientists and intellectuals in the 1930s, he came to Manchester as Professor of Physical Chemistry. He was a distinguished scientist, a Fellow of the Royal Society, who arguably anticipated discoveries in absorption theory and reaction kinetics, which were later the subject of Nobel Prizes given to others. As an event of poetic justice, his Canadian-based son John Polanyi was later awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. One of my chemistry teachers, my organic chemistry teacher, also a Hungarian, George Rada, himself a fellow of the Royal Society and indeed knighted, used to speak of Polanyi as a scientist simply with awe. But beyond his scientific brilliance, he took an increasing interest in social affairs and philosophical questions. In the late 1940s, the University of Manchester permitted Polanyi to exchange his chair in chemistry for a research chair in social science. And during my undergraduate years, I was given a college prize, which I was obliged to take in books. And for some reason or other at the time, I obtained a copy of Polanyi's Gifford Lectures, published as personal knowledge, and stamped with the Merton crest. It's among my most treasured books to this day. Above all, Polanyi taught me to look at the world in a multi-layered, multi-leveled way. For example, even an inanimate machine could not be described, Polanyi argued, simply in terms of its physical components. Rather, a machine is described in terms of its purpose, which sets certain limits for the physical and chemical properties of its components, if the machine is successfully to accomplish its purpose. For example, the principles of the design of a car determine which fuel must be used, but a car has a purpose beyond the chemical description of the fuel itself. The levels are logically distinct and attract different language. We discover the laws of science, but we invent and potentially patent machines. And living systems, Polanyi argued, have additional levels governed by the principles of life, which depend upon but cannot be explained in terms of the lower level principles at the lower levels of operation, the machine-like properties of our bodies, heart, lungs, or the chemical composition of our flesh and blood. Uniquely in human beings, language permits the development of concepts of truth, beauty, justice, love, etc. And this depends on our greater brain size, being able to support our sophisticated use of language. In this way, human beings are open to develop a relationship with the person of God and develop a religious sense in one form or another. And Polanyi introduced me to this way of looking at the world simply from his observations as a scientist. Polanyi's own religious commitments were rather wistful and perhaps significantly often couched in reflections upon participation in worship. When he lived in Hale, in this diocese, his biography refers to him attending evensong in a local parish. But he enabled me to make profound links between my scientific work and the theological study to which I increasingly felt called. And I think Polanyi's multi-leveled view of created reality may yet help theologians to clarify historic disputes, for example, over grace and free will, where the discussion can often descend into an unhelpful either-or rather than a multi-leveled both-and. Well, in 1974, I went, after I'd left Oxford, to the University of Edinburgh for 6 years of study for a BD and a PhD. I was taught there by Tom Torrance, who was a great friend of Polanyi. Indeed, he was Polanyi's literary executor. And Torrance was exploring the possible philosophical and theological implications of the move from Newtonian physics to modern physics. And let me conclude with a couple of reflections upon this. For example, it's an implication of Einstein's general theory of relativity that the universe is finite, if also, from our perspective, unbounded. But that means that the concept of the universe as a discrete, describable entity is rendered philosophically more comprehensible. The possibility that the world is created then becomes more rationally conceivable, a fact which I believe has undergirded the 20th century Renaissance in the philosophy of religion. Now let me unpack that a bit. Recall the Newtonian vision of the universe where space and time are absolute and infinite coordinates within which all events occur. But this gives creation divine attributes, for only God can be absolute and infinite. By dethroning space and time and making them aspects of created reality, Einstein, I believe, removed a source of confusion between God and the world, which had actually compromised our ability to understand either. It's strange, but I believe true, to suggest that the Newtonian confusion of God with the world, through its quasi-divine assumptions about space and time, came in time to fuel the development of modern atheism, despite Newton's own religious faith. And I believe the philosophical and theological and cultural consequences of the move to modern physics has yet a long way to run, and not least in relation to the understanding of order in so-called chaos theory. But let me take another example. The understanding of time, dependent upon the invariable speed of light in modern physics, helped me to ease the so-called scandal of particularity and understand how God could act decisively at one point in history, under Pontius Pilate and so forth, in a way which is nevertheless determinative for all times and places. And this is particularly important in an age which rightly puts such a premium on being non-discriminatory. Ponder this thought, that if you look at the sky at night and see light from a star, the distance of the star is commonly expressed in terms of the number of light years it's taken light from the star to reach us. But from the perspective of the beam of light itself, of course, it arrives in our eye the moment it left the star, because at the speed of light no time passes. So both things are true. It's taken 10 light years to reach us and taken no time at all from the perspective of the light itself. This is quite counterintuitive to those who aren't, as it were, brought up with it with their cornflakes. This paradox from our physical understanding of radiation of light, for me, parallels the theological paradox that the eternal God reveals and embodies his eternal and universal purposes in events of a particular time and place. It puts a wholly new perspective upon the New Testament description of Jesus Christ as the light of the world. Jesus Christ, as he lived on earth, is recorded as saying, "Before Abraham was, I am," and was believed by the New Testament writers to be both the lamb slain before the foundation of the world and indeed the one through whom all things were made. The uniqueness and the universality of Christian revelation are not, in my view, in opposition at all, but can be seen to be two sides of the same coin, and the paradoxes of modern physics help us to understand that by analogy. Now, let me conclude. When I first set out on my journey from my early scientific career to study theology, I had to tell my then boss of my plans. A rather hard-bitten northern fellow, if I may describe him in those terms. To this day, I can recall the look of incomprehension on his face when I said I was leaving to go and study theology. He slowly took out of his desk drawer a small dog-eared dictionary and looked up theology. But I can recall the definition to this day: the science of God. And the rest is history.